Okay, welcome to the BBL at the Open Gov Hub. We are a dynamic meeting place in Washington, D.C. that brings together 50 organizations that work around three shared values: transparency, accountability, and civic participation. And today we have with us Luke Jordan, who is the founder and CEO, CTO of Grassroot, which is a civic technology organization based in South Africa. And he's also the 2021 practitioner in residence at the MIT Governance Lab. And today he will present and introduce a brand new guide that distills lessons learned from the 4 years that he spent building Grassroot, a civic technology platform in South Africa. So look, without further ado, please tell us more. And as far as structure, just wanted to let you know that we will quickly share something in the chat of why you're here, what you hope to learn. And Luke will present for 30 minutes and then we'll have an open Q&A for the latter part of the hour. Thank you. Go ahead, Luke.
Super.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Isabella. Thank you, everyone. So I'm going to share my screen now. Great. So there you go. And there you go. Okay. So thanks, everyone, for joining. I'm going to be presenting today on a guide that, as Isabella mentioned, we've just released. This is a guide that aims to be very focused on practitioners, for people working in and around the use of technology for civic engagement, democratic participation, or social good more generally. As you'll see, a number of the lessons we hope can be transferred to a more general context. I will talk a little bit as well about Grassroot itself and some of the journey that led me to not just the guide, but also some of the non-technical lessons that we've learned about efforts to enhance democratic participation and civic engagement from the grassroots, as we're called. And what we learned about that in the context of South Africa and what that might mean more generally. But I'm going to really focus most of the conversation and the presentation on the practical aspects of what we learned over the last few years. So just as quick background, Grassroot is as Isabella mentioned, we're a civic tech organization in South Africa. Grassroot built a platform for connecting community organizers as well as major national campaigns in ways that allowed them to collectively engage in democratic participation. That's everything from presidential debates and COVID campaigns down to local community organizing. That crossed the digital divide. So Grassroot was built to work on any kind of phone, from including non-smartphones and including phones that had no data. And we did that over USSD. We reached over 2.5 million users and had 40,000 activities called in total. And as a kind of personal background, a lot of what you'll see feeds from the fact that I had happened to, by various circumstances, had a joint technical and policy background. So I studied math and computer science, but then worked in consulting and then policy advisory at the World Bank and did a bit of local government in South Africa before picking up technical work and code again. And so some of these lessons more or less feed off of that joint experience and background. So the first thing, and this is kind of the headline message, of course, of the guide, is to say, don't build it. And the first question is, well, why not build it? Where building it means, in this case, and the old saying that used to be very common a few years ago still is, of sort of there is a problem, let's build an app or some other piece of technology to deal with it. And now that's actually become, as I'll mention, what I've been realizing and learning is that that's also become a question about data. So it used to be build an app, now it's build something to do with data. But it's a similar sort of impulse. And why do we think that it's generally a good idea not to build it? And this is within Grassroot itself. despite what I said earlier, there were a number of false starts we had. There are several parts of grassroots in terms of the technology that I definitely were a mistake to build in hindsight. And I think when I looked back on both what we built that we shouldn't and what we've seen other people building when they shouldn't, it generally came down to not answering a few key questions. So the first and most important is, are people already trying to do what the technology is supposed to help them do? If they're not, then that's a pretty good indicator that the technology is not going to have much point. So if people don't find a purpose in doing something that the technology is supposed to help them do, then it's unlikely that introducing technology will help them do it. If they are trying to do it, and on the other hand, even if they are trying to do it, are we sure that we know why how they're doing it now doesn't work? And are we sure we know why technology will make any difference to the reason that their existing attempts are frustrated? So getting very clear on the questions of why will technology make a difference for people already trying to do it, to whatever's frustrating their attempt to do it, and if not, why would having technology make a difference? So the kind of projects, this is some examples to sort of make this more concrete, and these are things that I'm sure that I've seen come up. I'm sure many people on this call have seen come up, have seen floated, have seen proposed in one form or another, and which, to be clear, sometimes it does make sense to build. So I think what we would say is don't build it as a sort of general injunction that can be refuted or rebutted if the evidence is strong enough, if the questions come out in a different way. But the questions that really need to be asked first are, for example, if somebody is proposing an app to help people participate in public planning meetings. Well, if people thought that participating would make a difference or the meeting would be well managed, wouldn't a large proportion of them try and make a plan to attend? And so we see this very often. It typically happens where there are planning meetings that the reason people are not turning up is they don't believe that their input will be taken seriously, or they believe that the meetings will not be well managed. And so in either case, giving them a way to do so remotely does not actually deal with any of the underlying problem. Another example could be an app to help people report some service failure, medical stockout, potholes, electricity outages, others. And there the question is sort of, well, almost all of those things have some way to manage them already, whether that's a call center or or an inventory management software, other things. And if the particular company or government department running this isn't interested in dealing with it using existing tools, how is a new tool going to help? And isn't this a problem of accountability versus a problem of technology? And then finally, and this is, as I say, something that one sees increasingly frequently now, a sort of data dashboard to get real-time data on, for example, education outcomes, where often the question is, well, has anybody actually tried to do this using Excel? And if they haven't, then what makes us think that they're going to try and use it when it's on a fancy dashboard? Now, again, some of the times these questions can turn out differently, but it's important to ask them first before jumping in. And what we often found is that, as I said, I think a lot of the time we find that problems of efficacy or accountability get mistaken for problems of technology. Now, with grassroots and the whole, these are questions that we overcame. And what we did was, where grassroots origin came from, was we found that there were two problems that we thought technology could make a difference to, and that in the end, as I'll describe, in certain ways it did, and in certain ways it didn't. So one was that the idea of making local democracy particularly accountable often runs through what we call collective citizen engagement. It's very difficult for people who have very low resources to do that. We often forget that with access to great technology, but in marginal and connectivity starved communities, it's very difficult for people to organize themselves. Just the cost of, for example, calling a meeting can become prohibitive. It's also very hard for local leaders to access information that they can act on or to connect to each other. So we built a platform, the one that I described earlier, using USSD. So that's to work over any kind of phone. And this is just sort of a chart of, over the years, what happened to our user numbers. And I think the key things in our journey that I think were important were, one is that we did spend 6 months talking to community organizers before we wrote any code to be sure that we understood the problem. And that actually, we threw out a number of things. So it became clear to us pretty quickly that, for example, there was no credibility in local planning meetings because nobody thought that participating in them would lead to any actual change. And so building a bridge to help people engage in those was not going to be meaningful. We also became clear that people were already trying to report delivery outages and other things, but were not being taken seriously in doing that. And then really what people understood was that they needed to be able to engage in a critical mass to be able to induce any kind of significant accountability, but that doing that, one of the hardest things that they had in a very kind of spread out informal settlement was just getting everybody to a community meeting over and over again. So the first thing that we built was just a simple application that worked, that didn't need a smartphone, that reached everybody. So even when within a community, so it's hundreds or in many cases thousands of community members at a time, and just notified them and then reminded them that there was a community meeting, one form or another, happening soon. And then from that, we moved into adding additional features as our user base told us what they would like to see. And I'll talk through a bit of how we did that, leading to very high organic growth. We're seeing community meetings doubling in size after adoption of the platform, and then connected to larger scale use cases, as I mentioned, whether it was sort of voting in national election debates, so the TV debates, and getting orders of magnitude greater response and representativeness in some of those debates and in questions asked during them and in campaigns. However, despite a lot of this rapid growth, what we also found was we did a strategic review where we found that although we were dealing with a problem that was meaningful and people were adopting the platform, it wasn't always solving the ultimate problem that we cared about. And so we led to switching to actually a very low technology form of running courses over WhatsApp, which is what we worked with the MIT GovLab on. And then the large scale platform, we handed over to Amandla.Mobi, who's a large campaigning organization in South Africa. But this kind of growth, as I said, into the millions of users and extremely active and regular use across kind of different scales, hid quite a lot of scars. And the guide was an attempt to distill that, what we learned in building a platform that had that kind of breadth and depth of reach, and scaled in the way that it did. So I think there's a set of key messages here, and I'll say that I'm now going to talk through some of these practical messages of once you found something that you do feel like you have to build, and the useful thing of going in thinking that you shouldn't build something is when you find something, when you find a project, a problem that feels like it just has to be done, then there's much higher confidence of its necessity. So when you have to build it, there are a few key practical guide points that I'll put here and talk through in the next slides, but also to say the full guide has sort of quite a lot of detail on each of the points I'll talk through. So the first point is, and I'll repeat this, that outsourcing is great for bringing on individual, highly talented people and building technology, but is a terrible strategy. That means procuring the entire technology build process is, we found it has a very high failure rate. In hiring, it's important to add full-time talent very cautiously at a level where they can be kept in the team and invest, and their skills can be grown over time. One of the mistakes that we made, and I've seen a lot of organizations make, is to add full-time talent over optimistically and then find that one has to roll them off sooner, whereas it would have been better to hire at a more junior level and keep somebody for a long time within the budget constraints so their skills could grow. Get close to your users and do so fast with a dedicated community engagement team. And I'll talk more practically what that means, because I think a lot of people say do that, but then there's the question of practically, how do you do it? In every role in the team, speed of learning is really cool. I would say, and this is in the guide, that there's almost no point in hiring for specific technology languages anymore. The role of software developer at the moment is to learn fast using available resources, and any sufficiently good quality hire could learn almost any technology stack, as it's called. And then set a budget that gets you off to a quick start, but allows a long tail of iteration. So why not just procure? Well, the first point is, and as I say, this is something that we see happen quite often. The first point is, if you just procure the entire development of a piece of technology as a whole, so this is contracting out everything to one team, one contractor, then more or less the entire project is going to stand or fail on this one single decision. And so getting wrong that one single decision can doom the entire project. Moreover, in doing that, if there's no technical competence on the team, if there is technical competence on the team, then there's not much of a rationale for outsourcing everything. One can just outsource to individual contractors. If there's not technical competence on the team, then there won't be the ability to judge the technical merit or break down a project into its components. So that means almost inevitably, procurement will be under or over specified. There's an entire industry. I know this also through friends who are developers and others who more or less specialize in spotting requests for proposals and bid documents written by non-technical teams. They are really not the kind of people that you want building things, but they're very, very good at bidding against those kinds of RFPs. And often I've seen sort of friends and others in projects, and I've sometimes been the friendly developer who puts details in a technical annex, but there's so much more that then needs to happen in terms of getting good bidders, evaluating bids, reviewing milestones, etc. And often what we see is, or what I've seen is turning to external procurement instead of hiring a CTO, a chief technical officer, or just an engineering lead who within an organization can do lots of things besides just one project. If it's not important enough to do that, then should it really be building it? If the problem is not central enough or critical enough, so that it's justifiable taking the kind of risks for procurement, then should it be being undertaken in the first place? So I think that's the first thing, is sort of procurement on the whole tends to run these risks and tends to end quite badly. I won't talk through too much of this, just looking at time, but when hiring a CTO, these are just some of the example questions so as much as I was acting as CTO in Grassroots, I had hired an engineering lead once or twice, but also have several times helped colleagues or friends in other organizations in this hiring process. And one of the things that's really important in hiring a CTO engineering lead is technical competence, yes, but the ability to act as a peer within a senior executive group and really to be able to engage in a strategic conversation about the merit of a project, as well as the ability to hire well and the ability to mentor well, and then the ability to make trade-offs. Almost all of the work on this comes down to making those kind of trade-offs. And so the example questions that I've put here, and which are also in the guide, or some that I found could work relatively well to screen out good and bad hires at the senior level. Hiring a junior engineer, So at the opposite extreme, this is something that we did quite often in grassroots. Junior engineers, particularly in the nonprofit space, can be a fantastic resource. Often, the value that a civic tech or nonprofit or government organization can bring to them is that at a big organization, they're very anonymous. At a big tech company, they're very anonymous. At a startup, it tends to be very difficult for them to enter when they have no experience, or it can be an extremely fast-paced and very demanding pace of work. If they want to learn very fast, an environment that's a bit more stable than a startup, civic tech organizations or GovTech or other forms of tech for good can be very compelling to them in terms of providing a fantastic learning opportunity with a bit more stability than a startup. So some of the key things though to look for in that hiring are, one, a hunger to learn. So at the start of a developer's career, the speed of learning is just much more important than what technical languages or coding languages they may have learned. So I found very effective to ask them about side projects, or often ask about team decisions made on prior projects and why it was made. A commitment to quality. So often people think about within development, a lot comes down to trade-offs, and junior engineers who make those trade-offs well can be significantly more can contribute significantly more to a team. So trying to evaluate how they will decide between necessary shortcuts or damaging shortcuts, managing trade-offs. So what if scenarios, what if certain things happen within the project, how will you react, etc. And then basic technical ability. So as I say, I haven't put it in here, but in the guide, I talk about different team structures. And what I found both within grassroots and talking to other technical organizations and having helped other team staff up is typically, particularly in low budget, in restricted budget organizations, or where resources are constrained, but also where the problem is very difficult. The team structure that tends to work best is an extremely good engineering lead or CTO with a few junior engineers, as I said, have been attracted by the combination of learning opportunity, impact, and a bit more stability, and then just bringing in seniors very individually on a outsource, but for limited scope and as individuals. So being able to effectively hire junior engineers has been something that I've seen make quite a big difference across the organizations. Then the question of, well, how do you integrate this with the field? How do you get it so that whatever this developer team that's been built then works with the people who are in the field and working with ultimate end users of whatever technology is being constructed. And on the left-hand side, artificial, this is, I think, what we tried first at grassroots, and then found didn't really work very well. It's a natural starting point, but tends to break down, and that was you sort of have a wholly organized developer team, you have a wholly organized field team, and you set up some kind of regular meeting. So maybe they meet once a week, or maybe even more regularly. Maybe they have a daily morning quick meeting or something, and occasionally you try and have a team bonding session. We found that usually works quite badly. So normally the regular meetings turned into people sort of reading each other bullet points, and at the team building, people just stuck together. And so what we did was try to make it a much more continuous and individualized, but still retain some of the overall structure, but a much more continuous and team member to team member interaction. So what we started doing is that soon after bringing on any kind of developer, they would individually go on field trips with the field team, and not an organized field trip, but they would literally just have a day off of doing any development work, get in the car of a field team member who was going out to work with beneficiaries or users, and just observe more or less for the day, and then discuss what they were seeing immediately with them. And do that several times, maybe with one or two or three of the field team members. whenever a field team member came back from the field with an idea for, say, changing the app in one way or another, rather than channeling through that through senior structures or bringing that into these regular meetings, I or any other manager will basically say, just go straight to the developer team, start talking about it, and the two of you come back to us and say what you want to do about it. And then over time, for example, if a developer was trying to decide how to implement something in the technology and came to ask, should I do A or B? If this was something that, for example, a field team member really knew well, we just send them directly. And so just building that very dense, continuous, ongoing relationship among them meant that the sort of velocity of feedback and understanding of what was happening was much higher than it otherwise would be. And so what would happen is when this cycle was working well, I mean, it doesn't always, but when it was working well, we would have field team feedback from the field, from our users coming into the developers and then going back out as a changed feature, literally within a matter of days. So that would sometimes happen at quite a high velocity when it works well. That sort of comes to what do the timelines look like? Now, one of the things that we've seen quite often, and this is particularly a challenge, I think often in government projects, that we have timelines that tend to have much too long at the start. And this is, so people will take 6 months or longer to get something out, to build something and get it out and shipped. And then what will happen is deadlines will start being missed, shipping will start being delayed. Some of the underlying organizational problems will fester, and eventually in sort of month 8 to 9, version 1 will ship. There'll be a press release, there'll be lots of downloads, but there'll be lots of bugs. A lot of them won't be fixed. The download numbers will pretty quickly drop to 0 after the press release. And then kind of, I guess, in the more in the worst case, but then sometimes relationships with contractors head very south. And although it's taken 12 to 14 months, it's the project doesn't work that well. An alternate scenario, which we found worked much better, is get something out the door very quickly. So MVP means minimum viable product. It's a technical term. But so within 2 months, so design, build, ship, get something out with very good infrastructure. So by infrastructure, I mean the ability to change things in the app very quickly, or change some things even in the data or the use of data or the dashboard or however the technology is built. Then spend at least another 6 months iterating, fixing bugs, adding features, tweaking design, and then only start transitioning to a mature version. So really the key characteristic is, I think what I learned and saw also again from a number of other projects that I helped out on was you can almost always get something out of the door quicker, even if it's imperfect, and then spend most of the time fixing it while it's in the real world, versus projects that spent most of the time waiting, then ended up with something that was extremely bug-ridden anyway, but just didn't have enough time left to fix that. And similarly, in terms of budgeting, generally set a budget that allows that kind of timeline. So gets you off to a quick start, but that allows you to really keep iterating and fixing and reshipping frequently over the period. So then sort of coming towards the end, what did this leave with Grassroot? So having implemented a lot of this, and I think, as I'd say, I think the first couple of years, it was about learning a lot of these lessons. So shipping things that probably shouldn't have been built, taking too long to build them, having a team structure that didn't work. But I think by the second, third year, we had absorbed a number of this, and we're starting to build quickly and see the kind of growth that I showed in the chart earlier. And then what we found was about 2 years ago, when we went back to look at our impact, we found that Grassroot the platform had allowed people to organize at a greater frequency. It had allowed people to organize at a greater mass. But that what was happening was that they were then coming up against structural factors in South Africa and South African society that were then blunting most of the effect of that increased velocity of organizing. So I won't talk through all of these, although happy to jump into it in the Q&A. But one was that precariousness and unemployment just meant that with extremely volatile income streams, it was very hard for people to do long-term stable organizing. It was also very easy for distrust to happen and to grow or to be instigated from outside. In terms of institutions, South Africa, as a combination of the length of its electoral cycle, the absence of recall provisions, the extreme stability of party affiliation, and other causes meant that the bar at which sort of institutions, local democratic institutions, actually became accountable in practice was extremely high. And so even with grassroots doubling sort of communities, meeting size, it needed to be sort of 10 or 20 times that size before there was an effect. And that was beyond what we were able to achieve it then. And then in terms of knowledge, a lot of the organizing was being done with ideas and skills that were derived from the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, which is a very different time in terms of both the what the issues were and underlying society. And so we, our response to that was on the knowledge side. We developed these WhatsApp courses using the material from Marshall Gans's community organizing course at Harvard Kennedy, but we restructured that to work on WhatsApp for community organizers. And that we were able to get 70% plus participation through to the end in a free online WhatsApp-based course. We saw early signs of effectiveness, but struggled somewhat with funders there who wanted something a bit more glitzy. On the other hand, the core platform has been taken over, as I say, by Amanda.mobi, running national campaigns. So most notable there was last year running it, a campaign to secure income support grants for low-income mothers when the COVID pandemic hit and lockdown measures started, and gathered 500,000 plus signatures and was instrumental in getting that policy passed. So that's now one of the primary channels of impact. And now we're sort of, I am and exploring other ideas and forms of other ideas and problems. And if I come across one that justifies building, then I'll build again. Otherwise, will not. And so that's been a bit of a quick run through. I apologize if some of it was very quick and I covered a bunch of different ground. As I say, I'd like to have quite a discussion. The guide, the link is here, it'll be distributed. I think kind of the summary is, we'd say, you know, and this is a flow chart that we have in the guide and is sort of the one thing that we built to say, how do we distill all of this and how did I distill the last 5 years? So, you know, one is if you can avoid building it, if you can find a reason not to build it, then you probably shouldn't, because then it likely hasn't passed the test of solving the right problem. But if you can't avoid building it because it really is that burning a problem and it really is addressing the underlying problem, then one is hire an engineering manager, CTO, or someone. I think in the guide, one of the things we say is, you know, nobody would think about running a public health campaign or building a rural health or building a health access campaign without a medical practitioner somewhere involved. So there's no, it's similar to think about doing something involving technology without a skilled expert technologist involved. Second is ship early, so get something out the door and into the real world and getting responses in the real world as early as possible. Mature long, so take the time to iterate it and to make it work. And then no matter what, draw on what I call a trusted crew, an ensemble of collaborators who've been around for a while and work together. Build lean and fast, and get close to and build with your users more or less as soon as possible. And then finally, this quote from from the Bhagavad Gita, but it's also in technology. The one thing is it's a field where it's extremely unpredictable how people will respond to technology in the field. But as long as it's executed right, and it's dealing with a problem that needs to be dealt with, it can still, and this is why, despite calling it don't build it, I remain very optimistic about what the right kind of technology focused on the right problem and built well can do. So I am going to kind of draw that to a close and then say, maybe turn over to Q&A. And as I say, happy to dive into any of this.
Thank you so much, Luke, for your amazing presentation. And I have one question from Nada Sodi, who's in the room with me at the Open Gov Hub. She's the hub director. So if anyone else has questions, just unmute yourself after and feel free to ask. You can also drop it in the chat if you don't feel comfortable being on camera or on audio. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Okay, hopefully you can see and hear me. So thanks so much, Luke, for the presentation. I really appreciate how practical it was, not just thinking about, what's the end goal with the tool you're building, but really how do you build the right team? How do you build the right timelines? And my question was around the WhatsApp example that you gave these WhatsApp courses, kind of like a two-part question. First, could you tell us a little bit more about the content? You mentioned kind of Marshall Gans and community organizing. So what was the content around the WhatsApp courses? But then number two is what were some things that you learned logistically about how to actually deliver a course through a communication channel we wouldn't normally think of, which is WhatsApp. I can see huge potential for reaching lots more people, but also real constraints with what I would typically think of as an online course. So yeah.
Yeah, no, very happy to. So the content so what we did was we took, and for those who aren't familiar, so Marshall Gans is a long-time community organizer, both a practitioner of it and studied it. He was one of the people who helped coach the original Obama organizing team, and then I think the Sanders team and others. And he has an approach that he calls often public narrative and theory of change, which is a lot about how do you motivate a community that might have a lot of, that's very diverse, very heterogeneous, to conceive of and carry through common tasks. And it's a very practical way of how do you structure and work on a story, and then how do you link that to specific forms of action, and then how do you turn that into a practical campaign. So he has a course where he basically teaches that to his audience is sort of executive directors of formal civil society organizations from around the world, which he does through sort of Harvard Kennedy School's executive leadership program. And he was sort of super open. We approached him to ask him, this is material that we find is really interesting. Could we figure out a way to deliver it to a very different audience? So he kind of gave us, and his team helped us think it through. And so what we did was we took that, and it was again a sort of iterative process. It was actually a lot of these kind of ideas, but instead of writing code, we were kind of writing a curriculum and then working on it. And what we did was we broke it down into pieces. We swapped out text for media. We thought of ways to make it more interactive. We and basically transferred it into a medium that we could put into WhatsApp group chats. And then logistically, what we learned was, and it was, the first time we ran it, we had terrible completion rates. It was 20% tops, kind of got to the end. And what we learned was we had to kind of structure things as formally and as with as much kind of thought and effort as if you were running a course in real life. So we had coaches, we had a main facilitator, but then we had multiple coaches. We had breakout groups that people were part of. We had rhythms that were kind of agreed to. We got the roles we had to adjust the roles for them, for how that, for what roles the facilitators played. And what we found was that as we tweaked that, we eventually got to a point where we could keep people quite engaged over the period. That's when we eventually sort of got to these much higher completion rates. We did find that you had to be flexible, because it is, the great thing about WhatsApp is it's group based, so everything is conversational, which is a wonderful way to learn. You can add media in a great way, But obviously people kind of get distracted and various other things sort of happen. So what we found was that we had to combine people being multiple different groups. We had the coaches had to follow up. There's a bunch of that. I will say, and this is just to say not to say there's another guide, but there is another guide, which is and we can also circulate the link to that. We actually put online the whole curriculum, so the whole thing that we've done to kind of transfer it. So that's available. Anybody who wants it, and we also did a little practical guide for anybody who wants to replicate how we did it. Sort of what I've been mentioning about the roles of the coaches, the facilitators, all of that. We spelled out quite a bit of that. So also happy to share a link to that, and then anybody who reads that and wants to know more can reach out to us. Be super happy to.
Luke, I already put it in the chat.
Oh, great. So that's Elisa, my colleague at the GovLab.
I see Jed and Zurab on camera. Would either one of you like to ask a question?
Sure. First off, Luke, it's great to see you. It's great to meet you. This is such an important topic, and the way you've compiled everything in simple language, I think is in itself so useful. So you can see the artifacts of the Gans work, and also just once you've distilled it into WhatsApp, it's probably a lot easier to put it into a deck. Right? I had one comment, which is you talked about the origin in the apartheid context, and I think one lesson that's really important that people forget, as you documented so well about people's mentality in making these decisions, timing is everything. Something that wouldn't scale and wouldn't become necessary at one moment, suddenly there's, a flood or a viral video of a police killing, or an unpopular war, and then everybody, MoveOn really owes so much of its birth to Donald Rumsfeld, really, and to CNN for promoting the war, because it created a different context. So that's admittedly a little more of a comment. I'm curious, you talked about executive directors in your work with Gans, and you talked about practitioners in your intro here. I'm curious, is there a difference between how you can use the guide to persuade decision makers versus organizers or web managers? Even orgs that don't have CTOs often have like the web manager or the data person, as you called it. But that person often doesn't have the power to persuade. And sometimes whiz-bang consultants, who are overselling something too productized, actually have more juice, particularly if they're like the niece of one of the board members. So who's it for more? And did you find differences in persuasion between how to persuade upward or how to persuade laterally and things like that?
Great question. So I would say the audience is more likely to be the, let's say, executive director or just program manager or project manager within an organization who's kind of being buffeted by sort of the whiz-bang consultants, and sort of needs a bit of an armory of, so that's why a lot of the time we phrase it as these are questions to ask. Now, they could be questions to ask yourself if you're thinking about doing something. They're also hopefully the kind of questions that somebody can sort of insert into a presentation or into a board or other senior management discussion to at least prompt sort of the kind of conversation that might swerve a ship that's heading in one direction sort of back into a healthier one. So I think it is, and then I think the other point is, this is why I do say a couple of times that I'm realistic about the structural forces at work within sort of civil society and nonprofits, whether it's sort of donor objectives and other things. So that's also why we say sort of, sometimes it happens that there's a project that one knows probably shouldn't be done, but at least let's try and rescue as much as we can from it by either using it to train up some techniques internally that we can use, as you say, when something better comes along, or that we can use to develop certain internal capacities and other things. But I think my main thing is to say, I think this is, for me, this is written it for, I really kind of had in mind a number of my friends like running similar organizations who would kind of come to me and say, this is happening, we've got a donor who wants X, or board member who wants X, or like people in the organization want to do Y. what do I do? And I would kind of say, well, ask these set of questions and then see what comes out of that, either for themselves or in terms of guiding that discussion. So that's how.
Thank you. Thank you. That pragmatism really shows through.
Excellent. There is one more question. Thank you, Jed, for the good question and the great answer, Luke. I don't know if you saw it, but Divya Manocha is asking if you could please give some examples of recent civic tech apps or websites that have been worth building and why.
Putting me on the spot.
Just an easy question.
Okay, so I'll tell you one thing. I'm not sure if this qualifies as civic tech, but one thing that seemed to me to really make sense was, like you saw, I think this is a very developed world where it's become, it's because of, you know, vaccine apartheid for the way it's called, but places where there's been a sort of problem of vaccine appointments, and then people coming along, and actually the bad projects in that have been, you sometimes had these like massive sort of public sector driven, or actually some of those have been fine, but you've sometimes had very over specified, over engineered pieces of technology to try and do everything related to the vaccines, and those have often not worked very well. On the other hand, what you've seen is sometimes there's been often individual developers, but sometimes civil society organizations, and I've said, look, there's all these appointments out there, there's lots of different sites. All we need is, like, people need a really accessible, super easy to use way to just find out where there's an appointment. And they're trying to do that already by calling 5 different pharmacy chains or other things. We can just code something up very quickly to help them do that. And that's a case of there was a very specific problem. People were trying to solve it. They were trying to call around everywhere. Technology could help because it helped avoid them having to call around. It can help in other ways. And that sort of just gets you over that, and then they were built and they were deployed. So it's a small example, but often to a lot of people waiting for vaccines, it made a bit of quite a difference. On another end of the scale, what I would say is these are slightly more let me say ambiguous, but in there've been a couple of platforms for municipal decision making that have been very tied into participatory budgeting and deliberation that I think have done quite well. I mean, there's something called Decidim out of Catalonia and Barcelona, which helped in the fact that they were running very large scale participatory municipal decision making. People were trying to engage because the political conditions existed for that participation to be meaningful, but it was very hard to organize the meetings at scale. And so they built a way to do that. Now, as I say, it's ambiguous. Some of the directions on there I'm not as sure of, but that might also be another example. As I say, the conditions were there. It was clear what the problem was being solved for some parts of it, other parts of it, not as clear. But anyway, so I think those are maybe 2, but yeah, I'm sure I could find others, but it's a bit on the spot.
Excellent, thank you. I think participatory budgeting is an absolutely great example there. Does anyone else have any questions? We have about 10 minutes left.
Just a quick question. This is Nadeem, and thank you, Luke, for the presentation. So in addition to my day job, I'm doing a lot of work in Lebanon with young groups trying to deal with the situation. And I'm just curious if, and some of them are very tech savvy, I'm wondering if the lab that you're in is in a position where if people reach out and say, we need help thinking things through or a resource to help with coding, is that something I can direct them towards, or do you operate in a different way? I missed the intro, so I apologize if you've gone over that.
No, so I will say I'm always happy to have a conversation. I'm open. That is always, this is something where it's knowledge that I'm always very glad to disseminate. So I'm always happy to have a conversation. I think in terms of broader sort of doing a project or actual code or other things, I would have to defer to Elisa a little bit, who's on the call there. I'm not gonna put her on the spot by saying anything, but I would say I think the project capacity I'm not sure of, but definitely always open to having a conversation. So I think our contact details are in there. So I'm always happy to talk.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else would like to ask any questions or any final thoughts from you, Luke? If you wanted folks to take 1, 2, 3 things away from this presentation, what would you say? Other than don't build it, which is a very resonant and strong.
Oh, sorry. What, is there a question?
Yeah, hi. This is Irami from Guatemala. And actually, as a former developer, I'm in a kind of contradiction or struggling with my thoughts because I know that building also means owning. And sometimes if you hire a crew for making any development is a little bit complicated. Many of the projects are not successful because we don't have probably a good analysis and well, many other factors that can affect. So from that point of view, what do you suggest? Because working for the government, for a government institution, we need to give results, and we also need to have for the controller part something so they can research and give and do that auditors do. I'm not against auditors, but I think all of us have had the issues with them. So what do you suggest to avoid this kind of issues?
Yeah, this is that's a really good question. If I understood it right, which I think is how do you manage the fact that when you're developing, you have to be correcting things and changing them, but the auditor wants to see, oh, you said you would do X, so therefore you've done X. And if you didn't do X when you said you would do X, that becomes a challenge. And you will find with donors, it's quite similar. So there, I think there is an art, and I think what is possible. I would say don't quote me, but I wrote this in the guide, so I guess I can't say don't quote me. But basically, what I would say is construct your metric. Construct a metric that you know you're going to hit. Construct something that you know, no matter what happens, even if you internally think this is not the actual more ambitious metric to go for or the goal to go for something that allows saying that we were able to meet this goal. That then has enough flexibility, and particularly if it's possible to do, and a number of government systems have this, where they'll allow you to have, for example, like a baseline or normal goal and then a stretch goal. So one of the things to do could be the baseline goal is something that you know can be met, and then the stretch is something that actually motivates the much more difficult kind of work. And then when the auditors ask, it's able to say, well, we did this, and here it met this baseline, and then we'll see what's past it. That typically that's the one way that I've seen, or that we've thought of being able to work with people, but it's or to work in those environments. But it's very difficult. I mean, I think in the slowly in some government systems it started to change because auditors have started to realize, and other principals have realized, that it's counterproductive to require that fixity. So I think the UK with its digital government service, the US to a certain extent, are starting to change how they audit digital projects. But I think the main thing is sort of setting an overall framework goal over a long period that can be used, that can be met in a way that answers the audit requirements, and then over and above that, using the more difficult goal to motivate the kind of exploration and iteration. So I hope that in part answers it. You can hear it all.
Yeah, thanks. It's challenging because when you're dealing with people which is not from IT and are actually doing this this kind of auditors, it's difficult. But I get the point. Thank you.
Excellent. We have 3 minutes. So Luke, any parting thoughts for everyone here?
Right. So I think my parting thoughts would be, despite saying don't build it, there's still a lot that technology can do. I would say the first step I always say to people when they ask me about it is, have you tried to achieve what you're trying to achieve using a well-managed WhatsApp group? That usually gets you a very far way of the distance, given how ubiquitous it is. And then typically when I've seen successful projects, it's things that started with something that simple and low tech, but that answered a need so clearly that it was able to then expand from it very quickly. And it goes back to this point of sort of find a problem that's so compelling that it overwhelms the general bias to not want to build something. And that's when you're generally more secure. And then from that, get something out the door quickly and have long enough time to really change it and iterate it to get it stable and mature. So I think that's as much as I can say, I think.
That's really excellent. And thank you so much. Netta, do you want to say anything at the end?
No, yeah, just thanks again, Luke. And we can definitely share, thank you all, you and your team for making this guide. We'd love to, share that with our members and just make sure folks have access to that resource. And thank you all for joining us today. Hope everyone has a good rest of your day.
Yep, excellent. And if you'd like to see the video, we'll share with everybody who registered, and as well as on Twitter, you can follow us at OpenGovHub. Thanks a lot. Have a great day.
Bye. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.